Welcome to the video for C4.2.3. Today's lesson is about detecting anions. So last lesson we did detecting cations, which were positive ions. So what we need to know before we start this lesson is what we learned last lesson, which is an ion is an atom that's gained or lost an electron or electrons and is therefore a charged particle. And last lesson we talked about cations, which are positive ions. Today we're going to talk about anions, which are negative ions. And we also need to know that precipitate is a solid that forms from a solution, but again, we learned this last lesson. So before we start, you need to answer the quiz questions. If you're watching the interactive video, they'll come up now. Right, learning objectives. So after studying this lesson, you should be able to do the following. So you need to be able to write the formulae of sulfate, carbonate, and halide ions. You need to be able to describe the test to detect sulfates, carbonates, and halides, and you also need to be able to identify compounds from test results. So if you're given the results to some of these tests, you need to be able to identify which negative ion there is present there. So before we start, we need to talk about the formula of anions. So in group 7, we're going to look at the halide ions. So the group 7 elements are called the halogens. Remember, the groups are the columns in the periodic table and the periods are the rows. So if you look in your periodic table and find group 7, you'll see that it's got fluorine, chlorine, bromine, iodine. Now, when they form ions, because they're non-metals, they form negative ions, and we call these the halide ions. And all of group 7 gain 1 electron to become -1 ions. So when they're forming ions, they're trying to get a full outer shell. They've got 7 electrons in the outer shell because they're in group 7. So they're going to gain another 1 to have 8, and that will give us a -1 ion, because remember, an electron has a charge of -1. So if they've got 1 more electron than protons, they'll have an overall charge of -1. So the chloride ion is Cl-, the bromide is Br-, and the iodide is I-. Now there's also the fluoride ion, which is F-, but we don't do tests for that. We don't tend to use fluorine or any fluorine compounds in school because it's too dangerous, it's very reactive. So when we talk about ions, sometimes you'll see ones that have got the ending ate. So anything that ends in ate means it's also got oxygen as well as the other element. So for example, sulfide is S2-, but sulfate is SO4-2-, so it's got the sulfur and the oxygen. Likewise, carbonate is CO3-2-, so as well as having the carbon, it's got the oxygen. So if we had chlorate, that would have a chlorine and oxygen, but we don't need to worry about those at GCSE. So the 5 ions we need to know about today in terms of what their tests are chloride, bromide, iodide, sulfate, and carbonate. So first of all, the test for sulfate ions. So to do this, we add hydrochloric acid, which needs to be dilute, and then we add barium chloride. And when that happens, if the sulfate ions, it forms a white precipitate of barium sulfate. So remember, a precipitate's a solid, so you'll see a white solid forming. Right, the test for carbonate ions is, again, we add acid. Doesn't matter what acid it is. And then if it's a carbonate, you will produce a gas. And this gas is CO2, it's carbon dioxide. So if you remember from our detecting gases lesson, we can prove that it's carbon dioxide by bubbling it through lime water. And if it's carbon dioxide, it will go from clear to cloudy. So what we do for the carbonate ions is we add acid, and then we try and collect the gas that's given off. If we're producing a lot, we could bubble it through the lime water using a delivery tube. If we're only collecting small amounts in a test tube, we could just get a dropping pipette and just collect the gas in that and then squeeze it so that it bubbles through the lime water. And if it goes from clear to cloudy, then it's a positive test for carbonate ions. Right, test for halide ions, a bit more complicated because there's 3 that we test for. It's the same procedure for all of them. So we add nitric acid first, and then we add silver nitrate. And the positive result, it gives us a coloured precipitate of the silver halide. So if it's a chloride ion, we'll get a white precipitate. If it's bromide, it will give us a cream precipitate. And if it's iodide, it will give us a yellow precipitate. The way I remember the order might not be helpful for you, but it works for me, is that I remember if you look at those, they're in the order of the periodic table. So chlorine's at the top. Well, there's fluorine above it, but we don't worry about that for these tests. Then it's chlorine, bromine, iodine. So as you go down the periodic table, they get darker. So you've got white, and then it gets slightly darker because it's cream, and then it gets even darker because it's yellow. So it gets darker as you go down the group. Now, when we do this, it's important that we use nitric acid for this test, because if we use hydrochloric acid, then hydrochloric acid is HCl, so it's H plus and Cl minus. So we're adding chloride ions if we use hydrochloric acid. So if we add hydrochloric acid there, we'll definitely get a white precipitate, and therefore you won't be able to tell if it's a positive result or not. Right, we've done all the tests now. So your first task is to copy the table that's on that slide, and then use the information on the previous slide to fill in the gaps. So you need to include the test method, so basically what chemicals are you adding, and then a positive result, so what happens if it's positive? How do I know that it's a sulfate ion? How do I know it's chloride, etc.? Right, your second task, I realise this is a bit blurry on the screen, so I will, in my email, send you a PDF copy of this. I want you to look at that flowchart and identify the anions A to E. Right, there's an extension task for this lesson, so you can skip past this if you want, but it's a good idea to have a go at it. So we need to think about the word equations for what the reactions that we've done today. So the easiest two to look at are the sulfate and the halide ions. So when we write word equations for those, then to work out what the products are on the right-hand side, we just swap the two metals around. So barium chloride plus sodium sulfate becomes sodium chloride and barium sulfate. And sodium chloride plus silver nitrate becomes silver chloride and sodium nitrate. So you're just swapping around the two halves of the names, really. So bearing that in mind, I want you to have a go at writing some word equations for the reaction between sodium bromide and silver nitrate and sodium iodide and silver nitrate. And if you fancy an extra hard challenge, you could find out what the symbol equations for these reactions are, and possibly for the carbonate ion test as well. Right, that's all you need to do. Apart from, you just need to answer the quiz questions to see how well you've learned what we've done in lesson. So if you're watching the interactive version, the quiz questions will come up now. Okay, thank you for listening. See you next time.